You're listening to Badass Ladyfolk, a podcast about socially engaged women and NB femmes kicking buns, big and small. I'm your host, Christine Sloan Stoddard. That badass intro music came from the song Talking Hands by Toxic Moxie. As I mentioned the last couple of episodes, this is a reboot of my Radio Free Brooklyn show, The Badass Ladyfolk of Brooklyn. Now, Quail Bell Press and Productions is producing this podcast for and about incredible women and non-binary femmes from around the world. You can still find episodes of The Badass Ladyfolk of Brooklyn online. And you can find out more about the show on the Radio Free Brooklyn website. I'll drop links in the show notes for you. This whole episode is going to be full of show notes, so get ready. This episode, my guest is poet and translator Katherine E. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, so happy to have you. Now for some bio time so folks know who you are if they don't already. Katherine E. Young is the author of 2 full-length poetry collections, Woman Drinking Absinthe, Day of the Border Guards, and 2 chapbooks. She is the editor of Written in Arlington and curator of Spoken in Arlington. Her poems have appeared so many places, the Iowa Review and Subtropics and Prairie Schooner and many others. She is a translator of Look at Him by Anna Starobinets, Farewell, Ailis by Azerbaijani political prisoner Akram Alisli, and 2 poetry collections by Ina Kabish. I really tried, folks. Young's translations of contemporary Russian language poetry and prose have won international awards. Several translations have been made into short films. From 2016 to 2018, she served as the inaugural Poet Laureate for Arlington, Virginia, my hometown. So, dear listeners, I've been living in Brooklyn for a few years now, but I still maintain ties to Arlington, and that's how I found out about Katherine and her work. My friend, Ben Nardalili, another native Arlingtonian living in Brooklyn, also a poet, also a Quail Bell magazine contributor, forwarded me Katherine's call for the Written in Arlington anthology. I submitted a few poems, a couple were accepted, bada bing, bada boom, now they're in the book. Katherine, could you give readers a sense of what this book is and what response it's gotten in Arlington, Virginia, and maybe even beyond?
Thank you, Christine. So Written in Arlington is a dual concept. It's a book, a printed book. It's also a digital archive of poetry in Arlington, and that's called Spoken in Arlington. You can find that on YouTube. The book contains approximately 150 poems.
Wow.
Written by, well, and what's really interesting is when I started the collection, I knew of exactly 4 poems about Arlington, Virginia. So I was pretty happy when we got 150. By 87 different poets, and they were originally written in 4 different languages, including Hindi, Spanish, Russian, and then English. And some of our writers are writing in their 2nd or even 3rd language. So it's like our community. It's really multinational and multicultural. And the idea was to bring in not just, page poets or poets of a certain demographic. The idea was to kind of get it, and the grant that I got from Arlington County to do it was part of the condition of the grant. One of the conditions of the grant was that it needed to build community. So I wanted to go beyond, just people who normally write poems for books. And I ended up with poems. The youngest poet is a high school student at one of our local high schools. And we have poetry from people who were serving time in the Arlington Detention Center. We have teachers, we have healthcare workers, we have, a whole range of people, a whole range of styles of poetry. We have a couple of people who are primarily spoken word and performance artists, and they have poems in the book as well as they have video clips on the YouTube channel.
Neat. It just occurs to me that some of our listeners might not have any understanding of Arlington, Virginia. Could they take a virtual trip by reading this book, and sort of what would their experience be?
So I think they could. And just for anybody who's still a little unsure of Arlington, Virginia, it is the community. It is a county. It is directly across the river from Washington, D.C., across the Potomac River. You may have heard of Arlington National Cemetery. That's how most people know our county. The Iwo Jima Memorial is in Arlington County, and the Pentagon is in Arlington County. So those are the big things that most people outside of the area know. But it was a small rural county. It was originally actually drawn on the map as part of the District of Columbia, but it was split off in the 19th century. And it was a small rural community, mostly, at first it was plantations and then it was farms, up until almost just the Second World War, when we suddenly had a population explosion as a result of the building of the Pentagon. So as a community, it's been very small until relatively recently. And you still, you can talk to people, and it's very rare to find somebody like you who was born in Arlington and still living in Arlington. It's a lot of people coming in because it's so close to DC. People come in for a few years, they do something connected to the federal government, and then they might go somewhere else. So we tend to think of ourselves as a bedroom community, but in fact, we have a lot of history, including the plantation, which is now part of Arlington Cemetery, but that was in the hands of Robert E. Lee, and it was taken from the Lee family after the Civil War to make the cemetery and to make sure that the Lee family would not return and live in the house. So we do have history, and a lot of it actually going back, but because so many of us are so transient, we don't know that much about it. I came here in the 80s, but it wasn't until I was poet laureate and had to write poems about Arlington that I did a deep dive into the archives to see what we had here. And boy, was I surprised.
Yeah, definitely. I have heard and read that millennials were just very different in regards to Arlington, because in large part because of the Obama administration just attracting people from across the country. But then people like me who were born there, raised there, went to high school there, actually, many of them came back after college to work for the administration or to get involved with things that were just there. And they wanted to live in Clarendon. They wanted to live in Boston because it was cheaper than DC.
It is a very progressive community. It is a community that's increasingly urban. We have one of the metro lines runs from DC runs through here. So there's a lot of development along the metro lines, and it's really urban and it's interesting because it's also, the traditional bedroom communities with a house on a plot of land sort of thing. It's also a very green community, lots of parks, lots of trees. It's not cookie cutter developments as some of the ones that are further out. So you asked me if people who weren't from the area could learn something or could get a sense of the area. They can, because there are poems about the local hardware store or some of the libraries, some of the schools. And there are poems also they're written by people who live here, but they're about eternal things. They're about, inheriting their mom's, kitchen gear, or thinking about the passage of the seasons. There were so many poems about foxes submitted to this anthology that I couldn't take them all, which makes me really sad because I really love foxes. And of course, being on the Potomac River, where the Native Americans lived before, Europeans came up this way, there's tons of bird life, there's tons of animal life, and the poems, to my surprise, there's a lot about the natural landscape. And so yeah, you really can get a sense of who we are and there are a lot of poems about history. One of the things that Arlington is known for in the state of Virginia is we were the first county to open our schools after the segregation era, and we had a very peaceful and I think largely positive experience of integrating our schools. I grew up in a part of Virginia where it was totally the opposite. The public schools were closed for 4 years. So for me, that part of Arlington history is particularly interesting. But we also have a wall that still exists that was built to segregate one white community from a Black community, and that's still here too.
Wow. Readers, you can order the book from Amazon and directly from the publisher, Peacock Press. I'll drop links in the show notes. Like I said, those notes are going to be long this time. Get ready. Katherine, could you give our listeners a taste of the book by reading one of your own poems from it?
I would be delighted. This poem is called Columbia Pike Blues, and it was written for the Columbia Pike Blues Festival, which is an annual festival we have here. And this one was written for the 2017 festival. I will say I did a lot of research to write this poem, and literally everything that is in this poem is specific to Arlington. But I want to say a word about Columbia Pike, which is, it was for many, many years the only road directly from the United States to the from Capitol in Washington to the south of this country. So when you think about, the troops marching out for the Civil War, they all marched down Columbia Pike. That it is absolutely, it's an original turnpike in this country's history, and the history is incredibly rich. So Columbia Pike Blues. What is it that we want from our roads? To cart tobacco to port, raw grain to mill, cattle to abattoir. To take us out in the morning, crossing footpaths made by others, past clay forts turned to brickworks, where a man and a woman born enslaved are buying supplies for the first brick townhouse. To take us to the river, the ferry, the bridge, the school, the store, diner, theater, botanica, iglesia, taqueria, to lead us back home. You have to sit a spell in a place to capture its full flavor, to watch from your front porch as the roads straightened and smoothed, see the couple from Barcroft throttle the bus gamely uphill, watch abandoned pastures sprout radio towers to talk with Paris, thrust up garden apartment blocks where bachelors starch clean uniforms for tomorrow's shift at the Pentagon, embrace a church, rebuild a school, bury a loved one in its soil. You have to listen to a place a long time to hear its blues. Forest to farm, hills sown with stones, Freedman's Village, Queen City paved to park cars. Streetcars falter, no longer leave the lot. Metro junctions gape empty, the line unbuilt. Even the porches are long gone now. And always, the quiet padding of feet from long houses by the river, as the ghosts of the land's first settlers carve out new trails up ahead.
Thank you. You already discussed a little bit of what you encountered in working on this book, but could you talk a little bit more about your actual process for editing and how it related to your work as Poet Laureate of Arlington?
Sure. I think I said when I started this project, I applied for it, I knew of 4 poems about Arlington, and 3 of them were ones that I had written as Poet Laureate. So I really, really didn't know what was out there. But we have a really strong and large, and I should say also supportive community of poets, not just in the Arlington area, but in the general DC area. We tend to support each other really well. And we had for many years a long-running poetry series in Arlington run by a local poet that brought people not just from local communities, but nationally. Miles Davis Moore at the Iota Bar and Restaurant, I think. In any case, so I knew we had that resource, and I put out the call, and I was staggered. There are poems here from people who are currently living in New Zealand. There are poems here from a poet who lives in Novosibirsk in Siberia. His family happened to be here for a couple of years while somebody was going to grad school. There are poets from Heather McHugh, who lives out in the Seattle area. Poems from a poem from her. Poems from poets who live all over the country, and because Arlington's transient, they came here for a while. Andy Fogel up in New York was here for a while. So we just have a huge selection of amazing poets, who a lot of whom I didn't know. And I was so excited. I did make a point of reaching out to some communities. I visited a lot of local reading series just to make announcements to say this thing was going to happen. Can you send poems? And I had a long-standing relationship with a couple of people and a couple of the high schools where I would, talk to the poetry club coordinator or whatever and say, have you got kids with work that might work? And I'm really, really happy that we have that wide range of poetry here.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you've already had a few different media appearances, virtual events, all kinds of things going on related to Written in Arlington, including live from Diane's living room. Listeners, this is a YouTube show hosted by Diane Kresh, director of the Arlington County Libraries. And Katherine was kind enough to invite me, as well as poets Heather Davis, Jacqueline Jules, and Miles David Moore, to read some of our work from Written in Arlington and discuss poetry more generally. Katherine, are there other virtual events, media appearances, anything else going on?
There are. And in fact, in April, National Poetry Month, I am leading a 4-part course as part of the Encore Learning Series here in Arlington. It's called Written in Arlington, Arlington Poets and Poems. And we're going to read some poems and invite some poets in, and then we're going to ask people to write their own poems. So if there's somebody out there collecting work for the next Arlington anthology, I hope we'll generate some. We also have some readings coming up in June and later on in July, so around the area. And there's always somebody calling or asking, can you get some poets together and read to my group? So it's an exciting thing. Of course, the whole purpose of what we had hoped to do, if had we not been in a pandemic year, was to have a giant, basically party, open mic sort of thing when the anthology came out, and have as many as of the poets. We have, of the 87 poets, we have roughly 40 still in the Arlington area, and have as many of them as possible come and just read. But we're going to keep putting it off and putting it off. Maybe by the 1-year anniversary, which will be next November, we can do that thing. Because I think, having the poets all together, you did the virtual event. I find that just fascinating to talk to the other people and get their perspectives on why they wrote this poem this way, and we all live in this tiny little community. It's the smallest county in the continental United States, right? It's only 26 square miles. We all kind of know each other, but we have such different takes on what it's like to live here.
Yeah, I think I really credit you for this whole project. It's an amazing idea, and I think it could serve as a model for all kinds of communities across the country. Let's all celebrate poetry, celebrate where we live, explore where we live, also have a critical lens about where we live, make new friends through poetry. Yeah, let's do it. Not just in Arlington, everywhere. Okay.
No, I totally agree with that. And the other thing is, there are poet laureate jobs that are just about putting out this kind of anthology. And when you're sitting in your room, like this was coming together last March and April, right? When you're sitting in your room, staring at a pandemic, and all you want to do is be with other people, and you can't do that. But you can read this book, and you can, read these kinds of books and get a sense of, what somebody else sees in the quarter hardware store or whatever it is.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of the pandemic, you've been really busy. You have a lot to promote. So not just one book, but 3 books in 2020 and 2021. The next one that we'll discuss is Woman Drinking Absinthe, a poetry collection from Alan Squire Publishing. It's officially out March 1st, but hey, that's close enough. It's available now. Here's an excerpt from the book's description. The mood is Paris, the morning after a debauch, bitter, hot chocolate, a croissant, and a strong aftertaste of the previous night. The setting is Art Nouveau with its ornament and excess. The playlist is Debussy, Ravel, Stravinsky, and Puccini. Although we are firmly in the city, there's a whiff of the forest's folktales and monsters, bears, and Bluebeard. I'm intrigued. So, why don't you give us some more poetry? Why don't you give us a sampling of poems from Woman Drinking Absinthe?
All right. So the first one is Bar at the Folies Bergères, which is a painting by Edouard Manet. And I understand you're going to put the links in for that painting, so everybody can check that out. What should I say about the painting? One of the things about the painting is we know for a fact that the woman who is depicted in the painting is the actual woman who worked at the bar. In other words, Manet got her to come over and pose for the painting. And the other thing I should say about the painting is there is a glass dish of oranges, and there is some speculation in art history circles that whenever Manet put oranges in a painting, it was an indication of prostitution. So I will leave that there. Bar at the Folie Bergère. It starts with the scent of lavender as she buttons clean pantaloons, laces up stays, smooths her bodice and shakes out the frills, ties the black ribbon about her neck. Her costume smells, as they all do, mingled sweat and makeup, the fabric itself splashed perhaps with the licorice twist of absinthe. Then come powder and rouge, the small earrings, a pink and white corsage already starting to droop. Her props are placed on view: beer bottles, champagne, a vase containing 2 pale roses, cut glass bowl of oranges that may or may not indicate a certain kind of availability. Leaning against the marble bar, she doesn't look at you. Why should she look at you? Can you give her what she needs, or even cab fare home? Posing perhaps, or perhaps beyond posing, her face bleak, artificially rosy amid the moon-pale globes and crystals shimmering in the ersatz heaven of the cabaret. Perhaps a man inspects her in the glass. Perhaps he's looking past. Neither of them seems to see the woman on the trapeze, feet squeezed into ankle boots of lizard green. Later, she observes his red gold lashes, watches his still young face slacken in sleep, breathes in his scent of cigars, cheap brandy, scent that clings to her fingers like orange oil as she works her nails beneath the skin, methodically stripping the pith to find whatever's left of the fruit's sweet flesh.
Ooh, such a mood. Okay, next one.
Next one is called Bluebeard. And this, of course, is also based on the French fairy tale of the monster who kept the corpses of the wives he murdered behind a locked door. And then he'd bring in a new woman and hand her the key, expecting her to unlock the door. Bluebeard. His beard was blue, but not so very blue. So when he handed me his keys and warned me not to try the littlest one, I fingered the scrolls that curled along its bow, its tiny nape and teeth, and hung it from a silk ribbon above my heart. I tidied the rooms while he was gone, oiling the other locks, their keys. So what if I tripped over objects in the gloom, sent them spinning toward dim corners? Of course they weren't bones. As for the iron-sweet scent of blood in the air, it must have been my own. Besides, a woman needn't fear blood or bones, touchstones she's learned to reckon by. How else could she simmer stock from her body's blossom, coax fresh new growth from the very marrow of life? At last he returned, roaring through the door, tearing cloth and wire to free the key dangling between my breasts, sniff it suspiciously. Oddly arousing, his pouting, disappointed mouth.
Mm.
And the last poem I'm going to read tonight is a little sonnet called African Violets. And as we're recording at the end of February, it seems appropriate.
Yeah.
African Violets. February ushers in winter's rain, teasing the boxwoods, the trellis roses nodding in the yard. A lonely crocus raises its head, unable to refrain, despite lingering snow, silvery scrim mantling the sun. Houseplants sink into melancholy, recline swooning on window frames cracked and swollen from the heat within. Early mornings, I tend them, sprinkle cool water on their petals. Their parched, pale leaves nuzzle against my hand. Like young children, like new lovers, they've no better sense than to seek my caress. They must believe in old wives' tales, promise, of renewal.
Beautiful. Now, I believe you have a story to share about the first poem.
I do, The Bar at the Folie Bergère. I love the story so much. The poem, I was asked to come to do a one-night residency at the Washington Shakespeare Theater. And the reason they were doing residencies was they were doing a play in meter. It was an updated version of a play from, I believe, the 1730s. And so it was a period piece, right? And they decided that they would have a poet come in and be the poet in the house every night. And you would sit in the lobby during intermission and write poems and talk to people about poetry. It was so cool. But the other part of the job was, after the show was over, you had to write a poem and post it online for anybody who had bought a ticket the night before by like 8 the next morning. So you had basically, 10, 12 hours to write a poem. And I did it twice. And the second poem was, I thought, maybe one of the worst poems I'd ever written, and pushing that button the next morning to send out that poem just made me sick to my stomach. But this was the poem, The Bar at the Folie Bergère, was the poem that I wrote the first night. And it just kind of flowed. And, I'm the kind of poet who will spend literally 10 years trying to figure out 1 or 2 words in a poem so it won't be finished for 10 years. This poem was finished in like 10 hours, and I never changed a single word. And that's just like magic. It's like a meteor striking. And I mean, that doesn't happen to me as a poet. And so it makes me so happy that this poem has made it into the book.
Yeah. Could you talk about the concept and structure behind the book?
Yeah, the book is, it hits a lot of different things, and it maybe has sort of its impetus from late 19th century French artistic culture. I mean, you could tell from some of the poems, but it's more the story of a relationship, and to tell the story of the relationships, or a set of relationships, and to tell the story of those relationships, I didn't want to do, a Real Housewives of whatever concept. I didn't want a reality thing. I wanted to kind of examine them sort of through masks or through playing roles. And so one of the periods that I set the poems in was this cafe culture of Paris in the 1890s with the absinthe, which is, awful, right? And because the relationships are not cheery, a lot of them, they are the sort of thing. The reason we watch reality TV is to watch people mess up, right? So there are a bunch of things, people messing up in these relationships. And there were other settings that I put them in. I worked with opera. I worked with, I even used a little bit of biblical allusions. I did some Greek drama. I have a found poem from a scientific journal from the 17th century. So I just kind of played with them and wanted to, kind of tell these stories, but not face on full-fledged reality. I wanted to have a little bit of art and music, and just kind of, the other thing is, of course, the great opera, great art, great whatever, it's all about human drama. So right. It felt really comfortable to inhabit a painting by Manet, or comfortable to inhabit Madama Butterfly by Puccini. It felt like that worked for the subject matter.
Yeah. All right, listeners, I am adding the book order info to the show notes. Never fear. We're going to move on to Katherine's third book of this pandemic era, a translation of Look at Him by Russia's Anna Starobinets, Russia's Stephen King. It's out from 3 String Books. This memoir follows the author's loss of her unborn son to a fatal birth defect. And oh my gosh, what a moving and difficult but necessary book it is. We could easily spend a whole episode just discussing this book and your really beautiful translation of it. I don't know Russian. I've also read many awkward translations in my life. And this was just gorgeous. It was very compelling for something that is so emotional and just, again, so difficult. So you're an award-winning literary translator of the Russian language. This wasn't your first rodeo. How did you come to this project?
So this is a really unusual project from this particular author. Anna Starobinets, as you mentioned, is known as Russia's Stephen King. She writes generally horror or young adult work. She's also a working journalist. So she does a lot of things to pay the bills. This particular book was a memoir, and she said several times that she's not writing any other memoirs. This is it. And it's
enough.
This is enough, right? It's actually been made into a hit play in Moscow and Petersburg. I can't imagine. I have not seen the script, but I think that might be a project for me. So it is an incredibly moving memoir told by a master storyteller about her pregnancy. The child had a fatal defect. The technical name is bilateral multicystic dysplastic kidney. What that means is both of the child's kidneys filled up with cysts, and they grew to 5 times the normal size, and that filled up the stomach, which means while the child is developing, the lungs can't develop because his stomach was full of these giant cysts, these giant kidneys filled with cysts. Sometimes children survive to birth, but then they suffocate because they don't have the lungs when they're born. So there is no possible way to survive with this fatal birth defect. So the book tells the story of, first of all, the diagnosis, which she has a hard time getting because the Russian medical system, even for relatively privileged women like her, is not very woman-friendly and not very patient-oriented. And because of a lot of technicalities, the diagnosis couldn't be made until the 18th week of pregnancy, which was long past the legal limit for when abortions could be obtained in Russia. So then she had to figure out what to do. And the book was incredibly and remains incredibly controversial in Russia because she deals with issues of things that here we don't find quite as shocking, but they're questions of women's bodily functions, reproduction, and the other thing that may seem strange to readers in this part of the world is because of specifics to Russian culture, people are just told to suck up bad things. Just suck it up, right? You lost a baby, suck it up. You're feeling terrible, suck it up. And that has to do with the trauma of Russia, probably for millennia, but certainly for at least the last 100 years, where people suffered so badly in the Second World War, where people suffered so badly under the Soviet system, right? So you just suck it up. And the other thing that's hard for people here to maybe understand is because of the Soviet system, because they didn't have adequate, shall we say, consumer services, women didn't have access to contraception. Contraception was abortion during the Soviet period. So for these women now, their mothers may have had 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, however many abortions, right? And then suddenly the whole situation changed in 2003. The Russian Orthodox Church came out very strongly against abortion, and it was limited to the first 12 weeks. So you have this incredible societal revolution where everybody had abortions because they had no choice unless they wanted a dozen children, right? Then within a generation, abortion was pretty much impossible for people like Anna Starobinets, who was discovered to have a problem in the 18th week of pregnancy. Wow. So putting out this book, talking about her body and her diagnosis and the way the doctors treated her, which was not good. And then when she terminated the pregnancy in Germany, and the Germans said, "Oh, go back and get counseling," and she just laughed at them, because there were no counseling resources in Russia. And so the second part of the book is a really moving discussion of her trauma, her family's trauma, their inability to get counseling, their inability to find support. And then she put on her journalist hat, and she's like, I'm going to find out, what can be done about this. And I'm going to expose the people who did this to me and the system that was so dehumanizing, and I'm going to move forward. So in that sense, this is a really affirmative book, but it's not been, some people have thought it's just groundbreaking, and then a lot of other people in Russia think it's just vile. They hate it, and she's received incredible amounts of hatred because of putting this out.
Well, did you have any reservations about taking on the project in part because of how it was received in Russia, or did that actually excite you or intrigue you?
I have apparently a habit, at least with my translation projects, of choosing projects that have to do with human rights or, witness or whatever it is. And so clearly this is it was just it was sitting out there waiting for me. A friend of mine had written a review of it in English, And I thought, I've got to check this book out. And it is, I know it sounds, it's a book about a fatal birth defect and abortion and misery and trauma. And why would you want to spend months with it? And, you know, why would you want to even read it, right? She's such a marvelous writer. And even though the character of Anna in the book is maybe not always courageous, this writer is always courageous. It is a book that you just knocks you in the face and said, you have to read this book and you have to keep reading. It is people tell me they pick it up, you know, at 7:00 at night and they stay up all night reading because it's so compelling. And I think probably anybody who has experienced a pregnancy for sure, but I think probably any woman, right? And I hope also the men in their lives, their partners, can relate to this. You know, what do you do when you wake up and you discover that this life plan that you had set up for the next 20 years, you know, to have this child, right? And it's all gone because your child is not going to survive birth. And furthermore, whatever you do, the child is going to die and probably in excruciating pain. So what do you do?
Yeah, I don't have children. I've never been pregnant, but I really, even as an American born and raised woman, still really related to her journey with pain and also with dismissal, just disrespect from medical professionals. I think I've heard friends and read about similar experiences from many women before. Just our pain is not respected. It's not regarded in the same, it's not taken seriously. Even here in the United States.
When we did the book launch, we did a very cool online book launch with Anna Sarabinets in Moscow, and I was here, and we had a discussant in the UK, and we had the host way out on the West Coast. So all these people came together to discuss this, and one of the people in the audience spoke up to tell her story. I think she had the pregnancy here when she felt exactly as dehumanized, and she had a similar situation. The child was not going to survive. And she felt that the medical situation here, hierarchy here in the States, treated her just as badly as Anna Sarabinets had been treated in Russia. I think this is a huge question of how women are perceived, how women are over-medicated, how women are, our pain is diminished. And it's a huge, I wanted to bring this book out because I thought it was a particularly interesting lens for American women to look at abortion, right? Because for us, so much of it is about dogma. It is, you are a baby killer or the opposite, right? And what do you do in this case? It's a small number of people, it may be, a few thousand a year, when you are confronted with the fact that your child will not survive. What is best for you? What is best for that child? And to simply say, God says you have to bring it to term. Well, I don't know in what universe, what God would say a child has to suffer as badly as to be born and suffocate. I mean, it's the moral issues around abortion are not cut and dried. They're really complex. And I really wanted to tell, I wanted to at least allow people to think outside the box on this issue. And I hoped, and I still hope, that it will have something to say to people who feel they already know everything they need to know about abortion in this country.
Yeah, actually, on the note of dogma, I was very impressed with your translations of the intranet forums that Anna mentioned. Could you talk about what these forums are and what your process in terms of translating terms like preggy weggy and some of the other sort of baby talk or other terms that came up surrounding motherhood and pregnancy in these internet forums?
So the first thing I should say, of course, is the action of the book took place in 2012. So the world is, but these are basically chat rooms where people get on, and Starobinets goes to some great lengths to distinguish between Russian chat rooms and American forums for people who have children who have diagnoses like hers. I think she, in many ways, sort of idealizes what she thinks is happening in America, and that we are all civil to one another in these forums. Yeah. but it's in Russia, I guess they're not, at least in 2012 they were not doing a good job of filtering out trolls, and people get on there and they just scream out these women and tell them that they ought to be boiled in lye, and that they ought to be dismembered for even thinking about abortion because it's against God's will, blah 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 blah. But in terms of the actual language of what was used in the chat rooms, it was very colloquial in the Russian, and I was looking for colloquial in English. The term preggy weggy, which is one that just gave me fits. There is a particular social grouping in Russia that we don't really have here of generally wealthier or better off women who infantilize their pregnancies, and they walk around in pink overalls, according to Anna Starbinets, and they just talk in little itsy bitsy baby terms about being a mom and how cool that is, and they talk baby talk to their stomachs and all that sort of thing. But it's not, I mean, we do that too, right? But this is over the top fetishizing of the pregnancy. And I was trying to find a way, the Russian term is not preggy weggy, but I was trying to find a way to get that sense of just too cute by a lot into the term, and I just really couldn't. I have a whole list of the terms that I tried to kind of convey that sickly sweet cuteness, and preggy weggy was the best I could do. But I mean, that is translation, right? It's like listening for not just what the meaning of the word is, but the tone in which it's spoken, and the group around, the language that people are using. I mean, all of us speak, we speak differently to our children than we do to, say, our bosses, or then we speak differently to the people, right, the people like our workout buddies, right? We speak differently to them, right? But so translation is trying to cue into that too. It's like, well, to whom is she speaking, and what are the undertones of the words? And so that was a really fun challenge with this book as well. It was, the different what they call, it's called register, right? The different registers that the different speakers are using, the official doctor speak in the old Soviet terminology, and then the more modern doctor speak in the German hospital where she ends up, and just trying to get all of that straight. But I should say also that Starbinets herself is such a clear and just almost like a crystal clear writer, and it was just a joy to channel her tone writing through the book. She's funny. She's really funny. And sometimes at really inappropriate moments, like she's waiting in the hospital to have her abortion, and she just can't sit still. So she turns on the only movie that she can get access to, which is a musical version of The Three Musketeers. And there's a little song that they sing. It's a Russian film. And there's this little song they sing about, riding along on their horses and going off to battle. And I had to translate that. I had to make it rhyme. I had to catch the notion of these, guys with the feathers in their caps, right, riding off on their horses. And the actual translation in English is fairly far distant from what the actual words are in Russian. But my hope is that it captured the spirit of these guys riding off on their horses, and this woman staring at them, knowing that she's going to have an abortion, and her baby is dying. And then and she says later on she will never be able to watch that movie again. She can't ever hear that song again, when it's a standard in children's, one of those classic children's movies, and she has to leave the room forever after whenever she hears that song. So catching all of that it was a great challenge and a lot of fun.
Yeah, I thought you also, again, not having any sense of the original, I thought you did an excellent job of distinguishing between the German and the Russian doctors, and just how slight differences in language could make all the difference in terms of conveying empathy to a patient and to her spouse or other partner. I was curious about that approach. How much did you have to battle with words in the English translation to convey those differences?
Well, I think you put your finger on the situation earlier. It's much harder to do colloquial speech, or like what a troll would write in a chat room, or to render a song appropriately, or a rhyme. A rhyme is always tough, right? Or some kind of lingo, right? But the actual interaction with medical personnel she was that wasn't hard, because she was very clear in her Russian in rendering, the way the Soviet style doctors, the Russian doctors spoke to her versus the way the Germans, and because that was part of her, overall plan to distinguish between the two types of medical practice, right? She very intentionally, it's a memoir, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is a master writer making this work, and all of her choices are intentional. So in that sense, you kind of, you trust your author to guide you, and you catch the tone of the author. And so that wasn't me, that was her. And if I've done it right, I've done it right. One thing about this book, which is unusual about in my translation work, is for various reasons, I had a little bit longer. And so I was able to read every single word aloud, not just once, but twice. And that's a gift to a translator, because hearing it is different from just seeing it on your screen. And frankly, if you've seen it on your screen, you worked with the book for, 8-10 months, right? You're not seeing it on your screen. So to read it aloud and to hear the language, and to listen for her voice in that, that was just a gift on this book. And I really am so proud of this book, because I feel like it did what I wanted it to do as a translation. And so that was really exciting.
Yeah, you've already touched on a lot of things, but do you think that there's anything else about the story that might surprise our feminist, mostly American-based listeners?
So yeah, because, well, first of all, there's a huge fight in Russia about what feminism is and whether one wants to be part of it. And that's also specific to the culture, because in the Soviet period, there was official equality between the sexes. In practice, though, that meant that the women went home and did all the domestic work, in addition to doing whatever they were doing professionally. So when the Soviet Union ended, there was almost a social revolution, and the sort of feminism of women, and even before the end of the Soviet period, the notion of being not feminism but feminine, the notion of short skirts and high heels, and it was amazing, because Moscow in particular, which is the city I know best, is a major metropolis. It's got a metro, and not many people had cars, at least at the end of the Soviet period. And you'd see these women walking down the street in their stiletto heels, which of course were mangled by the cobblestones, right? And this whole notion of how you had to, it was in some ways almost a rebellion against the greatness of the Soviet period. You dress yourself up, you wear high heels, you look feminine and not like a robot, not like a female robot, right? So there was this period when everything feminine was being, pushed, and in the 90s there were job ads in the Russian papers. There were jobs for men, there were jobs for women. And now those kids, there were little kids then, that's this generation, right? Anna Starobinets. And so they are really finding their way in the world and trying to figure out, what does it mean? Because for a lot of them, making it means getting married to a rich guy who will let you sit home in luxury and you don't have to go out and work. So this is like totally different from the American context. And so when you read this book, or when I read this book, so my generation of American writers, women writers, we were pretty much always told, don't write about motherhood, don't write about women's stuff if you want to be taken seriously in the world of poetry or letters, right? And I remember sitting in an MFA classroom as late as maybe 2010, having a serious discussion with other women about, should we ever submit our work to a prize that's only available to women? Because if you win that prize, that's automatically, you're ghettoizing your work. That's the wrong term, but I'm trying to think of the right. You are labeling your work as somehow less than if you had won a prize competing against men, right? So that's not that long ago. And this book, there's a lot, and it's not just this book, but a lot of the Russian women whom I translate, there is a much greater openness and softness about being moms and about the family relationships. And in this book, there is a real willingness for the character Anna, the voice in the book, to be just a total, I don't know, she falls apart. She lets it all hang out. She is sometimes whiny. She is needy. And I would be too if I had lost a child under those circumstances. But I would probably have also not written about that. I would not have wanted to put that out for people. And that's one of the criticisms of the book, is that she put it all out there. And it's not accepted in the Russian context. So I think for American feminists, maybe the thing to think about is, maybe her choices seem conventional or not as progressive as we might advocate for, but you have to think about it within that larger context of being told to stifle yourself, to not show pain, to not show fear, and the choice she made to show all of those things, ugly and uncomfortable as they may be for us in reading about them. I mean, it's a tremendously brave book, and in that sense, I think it's really feminist, even though some of the attitudes and the conventional notions of what men and women do, we may not find we may not find much relevance to parts of our lives. But that's what's interesting about translation, right? Is reading about other people.
Right.
And the other thing I'll say about translation, then I'll get off my high horse about it. But in this country, we only have about 700 books published in translation in any given year. Last year, from the great Russian literature, we had 48 books published in translation, and 9 of them were republications of like classic literature, like Pushkin or Lermontov or whatever. So we're talking under 40 books, and of those under 40 books, only 8 of them were written by women. So we are not, and that's a statistic that's pretty standard. Roughly 70% of that tiny number of books that would get published in English in translation, roughly 70% are written by male European writers. We are not hearing the voices of women. We are not hearing the voices of people of color in many countries. We are not hearing the voices of people who are differently abled. We're not hearing from Russia, where queerness is still criminalized. We are often not hearing those voices. So there's a lot of the world that we're not hearing. And so, I mean, to be able to bring a book like this, one of the 8 or 9 books published in English by a Russian woman, and there are so many wonderful Russian women writers, it's a miracle. It's a small miracle.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Katherine. That's all the time we have, folks. Thanks for listening to the Badass Lady Folk podcast. I'm your host, Christine Sloan Stoddard. You can find out more about me at worldofchristinestoddard.com and more about Quail Bell Press and Productions at quailbell.com. Again, find so many links in the show notes. Tune in next time.